Hey, Dom, thanks for welcoming me on Mind Your Effing Business. I'm John Rossman. I work with senior leaders on helping them be successful at major transformations. And so today we're here to talk about that in a book that my partner and I recently released, Big Bet Leadership.
And John, is this book 4?
This is book 4, yes.
It's more painful, less painful fourth time round?
It was just different. It was actually a lot more fun and a lot more work. The Amazon way and Think Like Amazon. I wrote those really just like, okay, what were the things I learned from Amazon? And I did not try to be too prescriptive in like, okay, do these things. I left them open for questioning and ponder this type of thing. Big Bet Leadership in one way is everything I've done since I've left Amazon 18 years ago in making significant change happen at my clients. The co-author of the book, Kevin McCaffrey, was my client at T-Mobile. He ran new business incubation at T-Mobile. And for 3 years, we took many of the practices of Amazon and adapted those for an organization that distinctly did not want to be Amazon. But there was gold in adapting some of the mechanisms. So that was kind of how Kevin and I first worked together. And then he went on to run a big strategy team in the Google Ads business. And so, these are kind of all the highlights and the system of driving transformational change within an organization.
I mean, I like that sort of, I think one of the things you talk about is that sort of silent meeting or like reading it at the beginning or, one pagers versus PowerPoint, and you say they didn't want to do it exactly the way we'd done at Amazon, so they took the principle or the idea and they went, this is what would work for us.
Exactly. So, Amazon's famous for its working backwards approach done through memos and debate. But companies that don't come from that background, they need a more prescriptive set of approaches in order to do that. So we reverse engineered it and built a very prescriptive path for our work at T-Mobile. And then we reverse engineer that again and put that into Big Bet Leadership. But the core elements of it are really understanding the distinguishing feature or value proposition or problem you're trying to solve for. We call that the what sucks memo. Being very prescriptive about what's the killer feature and the core assumptions you're making to make that happen. We call that the outcome definition memo. And then the piece that oftentimes gets forgotten pretty early relative to innovation and digital transformation is making sure that you've got not just a business case, but a business case that recognizes the fundamental assumptions and risks that are embedded in the finances and making sure that you recognize those and include those in your experimentation log. So we call that the outcome financial memo. I refer to it as making sure the juice is worth the squeeze memo, because all of these big bets end up taking significant time and resources. And you have to make sure you're actually creating a great business out of them.
I was just going to wind you back on one of those, but I'm going to wind you back on, I think, on all of them. So the what sucks memo, that's the what's broken, what customer problem are we fixing, or what problem within our business are we fixing? And I think that's probably quite easy to get your head around. Is any challenges in that people should be?
The challenge is agreeing and defining that this is the essence of the challenge that needs to be solved and reframing the problem enough times so that you're really getting at the root cause and the addressable root cause that you can take action on. So it's one of those moments where you have to slow down a little bit, make sure you truly get to the root cause issue that you are trying to get to. But if you can get to there immediately, then you keep proceeding fast. But you oftentimes do these in iteration. And what I typically find is that people look at symptoms of the problem and they do not look at the entire systematic understanding of why the problem exists, or how do we create a more anti-fragile understanding of the problem so that we create a more durable solution for it.
Yeah, two things spring to mind immediately. I had a team here on the farm a couple of weeks ago. and they were building a new software product. And I said to the guy who's responsible for that, I said, and you've spoken to the customers, right? And he went, no. He said, sales gave me a spec. I'm like, right. What could go wrong here? I thought to myself. It's like,
yeah, and too often we understand that it's maybe a friction point for our customer or a challenge, but is it truly the high value, high problem goal that they're trying to get done in their job that they're willing to pay for fixing, that they're willing to pay a premium price for fixing, that they're willing to do the hard work of adopting and driving change? And so fixing problems, but not high value problems, those don't tend to lead to a great business. But I have a partner who always used to say to me, he goes, John, remember, clients don't negotiate with you when they have a fish hook in the eye, right? Like what you want to find is the fish hook in the eye, like the real painful problem, because that's what customers will pay you for, right? And personally, like that's the business I am in, which is actually helping to solve complex problems for my clients. And people who you, if you really want to drive significant adoption and change, they tend to focus on low challenge problems that their customers or employees might have, but not the real big challenge. And those are the ones that deserve attention.
it is likely also, I mean, you'll know because you've been doing this for longer than I have, but it's also likely that if you get that insight is not commonly shared in the prospective customers. You know, you're going to go, I think this is the problem, but I bet not everybody sees that's the problem. So we're going to have to, you're making your life harder because you won't be able to sell it to everybody. Almost, you know, that's almost true from the beginning.
Well, I think that's one of the hallmarks of a true innovation or a true change is that, you know, initially your perspective is sometimes viewed as comical or irrelevant or irresponsible. And when we were at Amazon, you know, we had a whole mantra around having a deep keel, which meant listen to external parties, listen to criticisms. But if you believe something, you believe something, right? And so, you know, have a deep keel. Once you come to this fundamental understanding, like that's the place to center on. An important aspect of this book, so it's Big Bet Leadership, your transformation playbook for winning in the hyper digital era. Well, what's a big bet? A big bet is not your normal run the business type of initiative or activity. A big bet has two fundamental elements to it that distinguish it from other types of projects or initiatives that you might do. A big bet has high ambition. It has the opportunity for truly creating substantial change and value in your organization. But it also has multi-sided risk to it, right? All sorts of adoption risk, technical risk, regulatory risks, channel risks, communication challenges. It has all of those risks, right? Fundamentally understanding that those types of transformations are different than your normal types of initiative is the first thing that people need to fundamentally recognize. Because what oftentimes happens, the vast majority of these fail. One of the reasons they happen is they think it's a big bet. And they start communicating like it's a big bet, but they run it like just a normal type of project. And that's the recipe for failure.
And then I thought the thing that really stood out, the next bit, was that whole what's the killer feature? And so often I'll have clients that were talking to a client about something and they go, well, and there's a bit of this and there's a bit of that and a bit. It's like, I just think that the clarity with which you state what's your killer feature, like if you haven't got a killer feature, go find one or stop, right? Because you're just not going to win.
Everybody's so anxious to start building a product or building a solution. But what they don't recognize is that this type of thinking, writing and debating, that is actually experimentation. And that is the if you can understand the problem and you can understand your hypothesis for what the future state is, the killer feature, the killer use case that you need to deliver, Well, then you actually have a vector, right? So we talk about the big bet vector as the foundational framework that you need to have in place in order to proceed. Well, if you have those 2 points clearly understood and agreed upon, then we can do what we should do, which is really fast experiments in order to prove those things out. But it's when you have vague notions of the problem and vague notions of what we think the feature is going to be or why customers are going to adopt it, that's when you get into these very long, meandering paths that are essentially a journey to nowhere, and they get very high risk.
Or you end up with a zombie project because you've got that sunk cost fallacy. You're like, we're 12 months into this thing. We think there's a big thing at the end, and like nobody wants to go, we should have just killed this,
And we have a specific chapter. So there's 3 sections of the book, Big Bet Thinking. We've been talking about some of the big bet thinking elements. Big bet environment, which is about setting the environment that's appropriate for a big bet, and then big bet management. One of the chapters in there is about these high stakes decisions. The name of the chapter is Continue, Kill, Pivot, or Confusion. And it's about how to handle these types of meetings, these high stakes meetings correctly, because there's lots of traps involved there. And you just kind of named one of them, which is you allow this zombie kind of initiative. And what a zombie initiative is one that you think you've stopped, but it's still hanging around. It's still consuming resources, and it's still taking attention. And you can't seem to kill the beast. Those things happen all the time. And that's just one. That's just one of the issues that happens.
What are some of the others that are in there before I go and pull you back to someone else?
Some of the others are what we call drugstore cowboys. So a drugstore cowboy is this might be a U.S. only kind of analogy, but it's what we call all hat, no cattle. Right.
Yeah,
so you talk about it like it's this major transformational, high stakes value proposition, but actually it's just a very mediocre product or service or transition. Right. That is a big time problem. The big GE Predix digital platform is an example of a drugstore cowboy where they made all these big commitments, but they actually had just a very average product. Another type of one is what we call a science fair. Right? A science fair is where people basically show up to show they're doing something cool and agile and an AI experiment or something like that. But it's actually just for show. It's just to show others, likely just your executive team and your board, like, oh, we're being agile, we're being innovative. But they aren't really put under constraints and the ambition of actually doing something meaningful. So there's other types of false narratives out there about these big bets. We wrote this book for senior leaders, and that chapter in particular helps senior leaders recognize the false pretenders that are out there and how to drive these high stakes meetings so that you are actually doing the most important element of your job as a senior leader, which is resource allocation. Strategy is the fundamental decisions of what do we apply resources to and what don't we apply resources to. And if you lose that commander's intent, that ability to say, this is what we're doing, and all of these other things we are not pursuing, you've lost control of your strategy.
Actually, that's a better place for me to pull you back to what the thing you mentioned earlier, which was the looking at the finances on these things. Because, I was talking to Alex Smith and, his definition of strategy, that sort of strategy versus strategic planning. Like strategic planning is just planning. There's no strategy involved. You're just planning. So you're saying, here are all of the resources and we know how we can deploy them and we're planning. Strategy though is getting people to do a thing when you don't control those people. And there's a whole load of other assumptions and it's in the future. So the way in which organizations I see often trip themselves up is they say, look, we could allocate, it's like, Reed Hastings at Netflix, when he sort of said, look, the people who run the DVD business, we're not going to have them in the management meetings anymore because they're making a play for resources. And then we want to do streaming. And that's their level of certainty versus uncertainty is much higher in favor of the DVD guys. And so And so, you start doing this rational process of resource allocation, and maybe there's one big bet leader or you've got one DRI, and it's like, they're going to be in the minority. Maybe people don't see or believe their vision. And so their level of certainty versus risk is very asynchronous. And what are your advice? Is it small investments, test and reinvest? Is that what you see working?
That's one of them, but you packed a lot into that question there and everything. But that is the fundamental thing that you're talking on about is certainty. When you are doing an incremental project or an incremental step or strategy, those things are line of sight. They are highly predictable. We understand the limited number of risks, and we should have success if we execute well. A big bet is very, very different. It has all of these complexities and risks to it. And so the whole goal is, how do you both increase the ambition, but address the fundamental nature that these are high risks? And so if we can pull those risks forward and test them out, then we can proceed in a bold manner. So the name of the book is Big Bet Leadership, but the play on words is, it's not the bet that's big, it's the ambition that's big. Our whole goal is to keep the ambition high, keep the big, but de-risk it to a point where it just gets to be a good investment when we finally decide to go for it. And so understanding the fundamental difference that this is going to be a wandering process. This is going to be an experimentation process. This is going to be a hypothesis-driven approach to proving out the biggest aspects of the risks before we make big commitments. Big bet legends do three things differently than very good operational leaders. They create clarity, they maintain velocity, and they accelerate risk and value, deferring as many other commitments or expenses until they've de-risked it. It's that third one that really highlights the fundamental difference, that this has to be a fast test and prove approach to this before we make big commitments. But people get these things wrong all the time for a great number of reasons. And that's why we thought this book was needed and was important, because there was no playbook for senior leaders to help do their job better when it comes to major transformations. And not that we got it all right, but what we have in there is right. And there is more to be written about this topic. But we give what I believe is the first senior executive playbook for actually, what do I personally need to do differently to lead transformations?
Because they are, by the very nature of this, they are, whoever you are as a senior leader, you are managing a project where you don't know the answer to the questions that you need to ask.
What it's going to take, what the results are going to be, how long is it going to take, is it going to work? You don't know the answer to those things. So we wrote this book not just for companies to be successful at big bets, but we wrote the book for those people that you're talking about that are leading them. Because there's nothing better for your career than to be on a big bet team, or to be the directly responsible individual, the DRI for a big bet. But there's also nothing quite as risky for your career to be associated with one of those teams. And so we wanted to give everybody involved with them an appropriate set of tools to fundamentally understanding the journey that we are embarking on when we are doing a big bet.
It feels to me that the people who should, or the people who are most likely to, entrepreneurs. So, I'm working in a company, but I have the similar profile as an entrepreneur. Certainly over my shoulder, there's my Colby score. I've got a 9 on quick start. So I have a high level of risk tolerance, and I'm happy to take risk with limited amounts of information. And it's those types of people, because otherwise, so picking the DRI could make a huge difference. But before we get into that, I think there's a human nature thing about wanting to do a thing to, like, why do people all the time? I mean, you sit in any management meeting in any business anywhere, and you go, hang on, this project's been green. It's now 95% finished, and now it's red. Like how is that? How is that even like? And it's like everywhere you look.
That's because they did not address it in the right way. What they did was they built in a very traditional kind of left to right, bottom to up approach versus for a big bet, what you need to do is recognize the limited number of significant hypotheses or guesses or risks that need to be proven out. You figure out some way to bring those forward so that early in the project, we address what those risks are. So that then at the end, when we're green, 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 red, what that red is like, oh, now we see what adoption looks like. Now we see what the customer acquisition costs look like. Now we see what the scalability issues were. If you had recognized those as the limited number of high risk assumptions that were being made with following the big bet leadership playbook, you would have isolated those. You would have brought them forward. You would have figured out a way to test them early because you can deal with stuff when it's early. It's when they're late that all of a sudden this becomes a real issue for everybody.
It's thinking that those assumptions are facts when frankly all you've done is made them up. I was working, It's interesting, I was working with a sales team this morning and I said, what do you think your model is? And they said, well, we think if we have 16 conversations, that's 8 engagements, that turns into 4 meetings, that's 2 proposals and a sale. I said, brilliant. How much of that do you need to do for the year? And so actually what we agreed is if they did nothing else, they could have all of those conversations in April, which is the first month of their year. And then if their assumptions are correct, they've got a pipeline for the whole year. But if it's not right, they've got May to fix it or June to fix it, as opposed to we're halfway through the year and we realize we haven't done enough stuff because the assumptions are all, we thought they were facts, but they're not.
In one of the biggest blind spots that this happens is in the business case around these things. So early on, we build a business case. We understand that there's assumptions, but starting the very next meeting, the business case is represented as a set of facts. And what we don't understand, especially around these major transformations, these turnaround projects, these digital transformations, is like, well, there's a ton of assumptions that need to be captured that are part of that business case. And those actually need to be part of your experiment log. So whether it's a unit cost or a customer acquisition cost or some labor efficiency number or the conversion rate that you're talking about or the churn rate, whatever those are, there's probably a couple that are absolutely critical to having a winning business model at the end and drive those forward. Furthermore, we talk about a really underplayed way to rethink your business, which is cost model innovation. If you look at every single one of Elon Musk's company, every single one of them approaches their business by how do we create a major exponential difference between the cost of our units versus traditional costs. SpaceX has decreased by a factor of over 100 the cost per ton put into orbit. Tesla has a $10,000 per car advantage over other car manufacturers. And by having a target cost as part of the design criteria, that forced them to rethink so many other aspects of how they approach something. And when you can have a differentiated cost model, you can do so many things in a market that your competitors can't do. You can have staying power. You can have market power. You can have absorption power. All of these things you're able to do because you've engineered from the beginning. You innovated from a target cost model backwards. And fundamentally, so I start the book, so the subtitle of the book is Your Transformation Playbook for Winning in the Hyper-Digital Era. Well, the hyper-digital era is the coming era of AI and disruptive technologies. And what the fundamental difference is going to be versus this past era of digital transformation is that productivity levels in forward-leaning hyper digital companies are going to have a productivity level that is 10 to 100x of the peer models who have not adapted that way of rethinking, re-engineering, zero-based designing their organizations. And so if you think the past 25 years of digital transformation and change has been exciting, this next 25 years is going to be terrifying. And it is going to create an entirely new set of winners and losers. And those companies, those leaders who are able to create transformation as a core competency, they're going to be the winners.
And how do you feel about having to start many to finish one or a few? So I was away at an event in Davos with some VCs recently, and I was asking them about their fund performance. Here are people who pick innovative technology solutions for a living, and they probably get it right 1 in 20. And so, and one of the things I see in organizations is to go, right, we've got it. This is the one. And you're like, guys, you're amateurs at this, and you think you've nailed it. And or the professionals are having to back 20.
Portfolio construction is a really important aspect of managing big bets. So this was a big piece of the work that Kevin and I did at T-Mobile, was create a portfolio. Your goal is to create contrast to ideas, to like, well, these are all the good ideas that we could do. We're probably only going to be able to pick one. And so what you want is an active portfolio of many ideas that we're writing and debating about. This sharpens our thinking and it creates that contrast. And then when the time is right, you will know the one that you really want to proceed with down the experimentation pipeline. And so it feels like you're wasting time, you're wasting resources and everything. But it really just depends upon the horizon of your thinking. If you're thinking short term, well, over the next 1 to 3 years, then yeah, maybe you are wasting some money. But if you are thinking about long term competitive advantage, durable capabilities, and substantial long-term shareholder growth, you have to have a portfolio of ideas, not commitments, ideas of what we believe the future could be, and be actively working those so that you recognize the one that you want to proceed with and actually expend significant resources on.
Who should be doing this debating? Because I could see you pull many CFOs I know into a room, and they would immediately be going, "No, I don't believe it. No, it sounds like a load of rubbish. Can we just get on and count the beans?"
And that's why, honestly, this playbook is for 1 in 10 leaders, right? Like, everybody likes to talk about like being an innovative organization, being an exponential organization, having an AI strategy. But very few are either willing to do the hard work that we're talking about or fundamentally change their belief system relative to how it does. But if you look at the great companies that are out there making the future right now, this is how Amazon believes. This is how they act. This is how senior leaders spend their time. And one of the things we'll oftentimes do with our clients is we look at the senior leaders' priorities and where they actually spend their time. And if 90% of your time is spent in today's business, my orientation would be, well, you've got it all backwards. You need to create a better balance of working in today's business versus working in tomorrow's business. And you can have teams do a lot of the hard work, but you actually need to be actively involved in the debate, in the thinking, in the curiosity that this is all fundamentally about, so that you can make the big time commander's intent decisions about, here's the mission we are going to go proceed with.
So there's a time commitment. Do you have a sense of percent of profit, percent of revenue?
Someplace between 25 and 50% of senior leadership time needs to be beyond this year's business.
That's why they need better teams. That's why they need to hire better people, develop better teams so that they can do this work. So that's 50% commitment of time. Is there a sense of commitment of money, revenue, margin?
if you think about the portfolio of initiatives like directable implementation expense that you can deploy into a business, right? Here's all the projects we could do. That varies very differently between industry and between the phase of your business. But if you have kind of like, hey, here's my operating expense and here's what's left over. Here's what we have choice about what we deploy it to. Approximately 10 to 30 to 40% of that should be on major transformational changes versus kind of run the business initiatives. That tends to be the right types of ratios.
Fab. The other thing that we've mentioned a little bit is sort of DRI. And so, again, one of the things that I see all the time is either the new business versus the legacy business. It's the same leadership team across both. And I mentioned, what did Netflix do? They split that up. But here it's even more specific. It's if this is a bet, give it to somebody.
Yeah, and it's not just a project manager that we give it to. Sometimes we have a full-time project manager on it and everything. It's like that's great. You need somebody that has sway in the organization, right? They need to be a senior person who knows how to get things done across the organization, right? One of the critical habits is maintaining velocity. You do that. One of the ways you do that is by having a senior person who knows how to get things done within the organization, and they are bold at maneuvering this. They need to be full-time committed to this initiative. This is one of the very few truly controllable factors that we have to be successful at these big bets. If it doesn't need this type of attention, it likely is really an incremental project and you should have a different type of approach to it. But if this has high ambition and multi-sided risks, it takes significant senior attention that is fully obsessed to it, that is fully committed to testing it out. That's the job of a DRI.
Yeah, I had Jim Urchner on who did this type of work at Goodyear. They allocated him a budget and in his case, he was spinning these things up outside the organization or in parallel to the organization. Do you think that there's value in doing that?
There can be. That was largely my co-author's job, Kevin McCaffrey, at what T-Mobile was incubating a portfolio of concepts. And then when they got to a point of like, okay, it's time to scale it, we would hand it off into a team, and we would oftentimes integrate it back into the business. There's no one right way to do it, but the ways to get it wrong are to not put these teams under constraints. So constraints are super important. These help prevent the innovation team or the labs team from being, these science fair experiments and disconnected from the business. Yeah, and so we talk a lot about the constraints that you need to put these programs under to make sure that you are both thinking them through well, but that you don't suffer from analysis paralysis. And those are the super important constraints that you're typically thinking through.
What else? What other things? What else in key things in the book haven't we spoken about now?
Yeah, I think it's about communication and being super clear on the words that we choose. We talk about being the chief repeating officer in the book, and that it's a significant lever for being successful at these changes is having on point repeated communication. And we describe all the mistakes and the prescriptions to those mistakes. And what senior leaders tend to do on these major transformations is they tend to complain about the current state. They talk about why change is needed, but they are not clear, specific, or consistent about what we are doing or the journey that we are on. So they do not signal, well, this is how we are going to be different. This is our hypothesis, and we are testing this out. So they are very vague about what the future is, and they talk about being wholly committed to it. Well, you shouldn't be wholly committed to it because you haven't tested it out. But they don't use appropriate language in describing the type of journey that we are on. And that makes it very difficult for teams to understand what their job is relative to this change. So communication is an absolutely critical component of being a successful big bet legend. And you need to have a specific set of set of techniques and communication in order to do that job well.
I love that. I'm going to wake up tomorrow and be a big bet legend. There's ambition in there, and also risk.
Absolutely, exactly. Of all of Jeff Bezos' absolute superpowers and everything, I think one that doesn't get enough press or enough highlight is what a fantastic, on point, repeated communicator he is. A key example is Amazon's 1997 shareholder letter talked about what Amazon believed in, what they were going to prioritize, what they were going to optimize for, and it invited investors to not invest in Amazon if you don't believe those things. Every year since then, they attached the 1997 shareholder letter to their current year's shareholder letter in order to repeat these are our fundamental beliefs that they will optimize for long-term shareholder value, not short-term financial results. And they will always be an inventor, and they believe that it's day one relative to the things that are possible. Those are Amazon's fundamental beliefs. And the power of doing that in a very clear and simple set of languages and repeating that is just part of what Amazon got so right.
And the other thing that strikes me about the stories that you tell of the things that you've been involved in with Jeff was that the amount of detail, and, having read the Elon Musk biography, the detail, the sort of first principle, no, I think you're talking shite at me. You need to get, you're going to need to, it just doesn't make sense, right? As opposed to somebody turning it with a PowerPoint and get it rubber stamped and it moves on. And so, with the DRI sweating that detail.
And the reason they're able to do that, because there's millions of details they could focus on, but they figure out how to focus on the detail or the limited number of details that really matter. Well, because they have a clear understanding of the problem they are trying to solve. They have a hypothesis or a target about what that killer feature is, and they go to the root of what it's going to take to accomplish that new killer feature. That is exactly the playbook that we have been talking about, is that orientation. So they naturally do those things. Big bet leadership helps bring the tools and the system to other leaders to be able to focus in on exactly those types of insights.
Fabulous. John, other than big bet leadership, what have you been reading? What should people pick up? What have you liked?
We mentioned in Big Bet Leadership that I think is really the fundamental book on strategy is a book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, and done by a professor called Richard Rumalt. And that fundamentally will shatter your beliefs about what good strategy is and what planning should be. And his essence is that good strategy attacks a problem in a business. And so we build on that notion of what a good strategy is to help avoid bad strategy.
And you got anything else?
Oh, I mean, I've got lots of things. I listened to the Elon Musk book, and the thing I loved about that book was that they mentioned in that book delete, delete, delete 33 times. This is part of Elon's algorithm, right? And so he innovates by simplicity, by simplifying things, by zero-based design, and not suffering from regulations or rules or the constraints that others put on what it takes to do. And so a lot of my work is about decalcifying businesses, simplifying them, making them faster, making them simpler, decomplifying them. If Elon's book really leans into why that's critical, and obviously a very well written book.
And I think you also mention how big things get done.
I do mention that book. Yes, that's a very good book. And then the other book we reference a lot, especially on the communication pieces, is the book Switch: How to Make Change When Change is Hard. And they really they break open this whole communication challenge relative to major changes and how critical communication is. So we, like everybody, we build on the shoulders of others and bring a new perspective and integrate a lot of these aspects together.
Fab. John, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. Thanks for coming on.
Dom, you are a master. Thank you for having me on.